Greetings, this is iVideo. My name is John Savers, and this is a series we are pursuing, a small series on the subject of race. We have touched on the area with a notion of allowing as much possible information of a scientific nature to be shown. We have noted that there is not so much evidence of a comparative morphology between various sorts of humans, kinds, since 1950, and therefore the date we have to rely upon is as much as 150 years old or so. Now, the scientists we rely upon are eminent men, men of great renown and so forth. There's no question about the skill of their scientific method, and their conclusions are clear and are certainly valid. I think you are, of course, able to make your own decisions, but I think you should have the decision, the right to hear the facts and make a more rounded decision than I think is possible with the data presently given to you. Now, we reject the evolutionist position. We don't believe in altering the definition of terms, but sticking with them. The term species, for instance, derives from a Latin word which means to see, and therefore relates to the external design or structure of something. And when the design is clearly different from that of another, it's reasonable to assume there are two different things. At any rate, we have plunged ahead on this because of some negative feedback we received in another program on the subject of race, and it seems to me there's a good deal of confusion about the term. There is a sort of an automatic kind of thinking in some quarters in regard to this subject that race automatically means white people thinking of themselves better than others, or exhibiting hatred for others and so forth, which is all rubbish. But what we are really saying in terms of racial position or recognition is that there are indeed different races with different objective characteristics which can be scientifically determined, and we're not talking about mere varieties, which is what the evolutionists would have us believe. Now, we have given position which I think fairly discredits evolutionists. They, of course, are presently reigning, holding the floor in debate and so forth, but this is largely due to their being in control of the universities and colleges and so forth, media propagandists and so forth, so that they're able to present a unified front while squelching any attempt by others to present another case. So there you have it. But we did note that the idea of equality, racial equality, and all this really is a spin-off of Freemasonry's March to the Fore in its global designs, and it is, of course, something which springs most clearly from the Masonic watchword, equality. Therefore, since Masonry is in effect a universal religion, a violation of this watchword, the sense of it is like violating a religious commandment, and therefore is deemed a sin by many people who go about and point at you more or less as if you were a great sinner. I can see people now being forced to wear great red R's on their lapels, racist or something, much as in the scarlet letter of the famed novel. But be that as it may, I have pointed out this is not my religion. Being an Israelite Christian, I don't really have much good to say about heathen idols and so forth. But many people are of that persuasion. So we are in a situation which calls for really national debate, which I believe that I will enter into more readily in the series celebration. But at any rate, we are still trying to pursue this question and nail it down. We intend to talk more specifically about the major general racial groups, species today, and we will, as before, rely heavily upon the experts. For we were called by Mr. Jesse Jackson to have the scientists, the academics, the experts speak on the subject, and there had been apparently some silence before this. So with an idea of helping him in this way, and in, shall we say, conjunction with and urge under the impel of the President's call for frank racial discussion, we are plunging forward. So if you'll please attend to the following. There's an interesting distinction that can be observed in the varying degrees of facial and skull angles between the different races of Homo or man. The scientific study of comparative anatomy by means of angular measurements was pioneered by the Dutch anatomist Petrus Camper in the latter half of the 18th century. The facial angle is now quite popular as a quantitative method for the objective comparison of the races of man with one another and with certain animals. The illustrations from Camper's work shows that in apes and monkeys, the slope of the forehead, upper face, and upper jaw all combine to give a very low facial angle. It might be interesting to put an illustration on the board if we can right now. Could we do this? Table of facial angles. Newfoundland dog, 25 degree. Small ape, 42 degrees. Gorilla, 52 degrees. Young orangutan, 58 degrees. Bourgeoisman, 64 to 66 degrees. Negro, 68 to 70. Mongol, 74 to 76. And European, 80 to 82. Well, now I'd like you to consider the following, please. Those animals with the longest snouts are always considered the most stupid and gluttonous. When we descend to reptiles and fishes, the jaws seem to constitute almost all the head. On the other hand, a great degree of intelligence is attributed to the elephant from his well-marked forehead. Even among men, we instinctively regard him as stupid and sensual, whose face is very prominent and whose forehead is receding. Facial angles are, according to the evidence of ancient Egyptian records, a permanent and specific characteristic. The differences that exist between the Bushman and European would warrant their being termed distinct species. This is from the Origin of Race and Civilization, pages 100 to 102, citing in part, in turn, Petrus Camper, Dissertation Physique, Difference des Traits du Visage, 1791. Wilder, Opsite, page 207. G. Dallas Lynn, M.D., The Marvelous Story of Man, 1900, page 130. Smith and Neelan, Natural History of the Human Species, page 16. Now, it might be possible to put an illustration of that on the board, and if so, let's do so now. I think it would be well if you consider this very carefully. The brain is the key to the animal kingdom. As early as 1770, the famed naturalist Blumenbach had made note of the different mental faculties of the races of man in stating the mental varieties seem equal to and sometimes greater than the bodily varieties of man. Please note the following. A common comparison is that of the Negro and white races, revealing distinct differences in the structure of the two brains, indicating a difference in emotional, mental efficiency and ability, social and cultural development, etc. As to structure of the brain, Dr. Robert Bean found that the Negro brain differs from the white fundamentally in that there is a depression of the anterior association center and a relative bulging of the posterior association center. The difference in size is primarily in the frontal lobe, and it follows that the anterior association center is both absolutely and relatively smaller. The frontal lobe of the Negro brain is not only smaller, it is less rounded and full and has more pointed projections above and below, shallower fissures, a smaller proportion of white matter, and simple convolutions. After citing other data, he says, this suggests a probable difference in the relative mental power or capacity or activity of the frontal lobes in the brains of the two races, there being a difference of 20% in favor of the Caucasian. This is much greater in many individuals. Dr. Todd also finds striking differences in the proportion of parts in the Negro brain as compared with the white, and suggests the desirability of determining special formulae for the Negro. Not only are many Negro crania more developed in the vortex than in the frontal and occipital areas, but they have also transverse and horizontal contours very different from those of the white. Finally, assuming that the posterior association centers are concerned with the sense powers, bodily coordinations, musical sense, and appetites, whereas the anterior centers are concerned with self-control, judgment, and reason, one can perceive a neurological basis for racial differences in behavior and in characteristic roles in cultural history. Intelligence and creative thinking largely depend on the richness of the convolutions, that is to say, their development in number and tortuosity. Large and simple convolutions are thus a sign of idiocy or weak intellect. Small convolutions with numerous foldings are a sign of large intellectual capacity. This is from The Origin of Race and Civilization, pages 102, 105, citing in turn J.F. Blumenbach on the Natural Varieties of Mankind, page 389, Hankins, The Racial Basis of Civilization, page 313, Hankins again, pages 317 and 318, Paul Topinard, Anthropology, page 106. Now, it may be possible to put on the board some examples of brains and so forth to give the viewer a better idea of the matter of convolutions and thickness and so forth. Furthermore, Dr. Agassiz says, a peculiar conformation characterizes the brain of an adult Negro. Its development never goes beyond that developed in the Caucasian in boyhood. And besides other singularities, it bears in several particulars a marked resemblance to the brain of the orangutan. Dr. Topinard states that the cranial sutures are more simple in the Negro than in the white type and are obliterated sooner. This has the effect of restricting brain development in the Negro race. I'd like you to consider this. Dr. C.J. Conley, in describing the Australian Aborigine in an article, offers the following information. A race now generally regarded as very primitive is the Australian. Single brains have been described by various authors, and there appears to be agreement as to the simplicity of the convolutional pattern. The most extensive work on fissures of the Australian brain is that of Shell Shear, 1937, who gives detailed descriptions. He concludes that in the Australian there is clear evidence of a lack of development of the precuneal, parietal, temporal, and frontal regions. This is from The Origin of Race and Civilization, page 106, citing in turn Alexander Winchell, Pre-Adamites, 1880, page 250. A.H. Sayce, Races of the Old Testament, pages 21 and 22. Dr. Knott, Types of Mankind, page 415. Paul Topinard, Anthropology, page 488. C. Connolly, External Morphology of the Primitive Brain, 1950, page 263. Now for a detailed account of two different brains from different species, I will provide the following information. In a review by George Combe of Morton's Crania Americana may be found a most interesting comparison of the brains of American Aborigines with the European. Comparisons of any two well-marked types would yield results quite as striking. A few extracts are all we can afford from an article that, commanding the respect, will excite the interest of the reader. No adequately instructed naturalist doubts that the brain is an organ of the mind, but there are two questions on which great difference of opinion continues to prevail. One, whether the size of the brain, health, age, and constitution being equal, has any, and if so, what influence on the power of mental manifestations. Two, whether different faculties are, or are not, manifested by particular portions of the brain. I believe that all scientific men concede that brains below a certain size are always indicative of idiocy, and that men of distinguished mental faculties have large heads. One of the most singular features in the history of this continent is that the aboriginal races, with few exceptions, have perished or constantly receded before the Anglo-Saxon race, and have in no instance, not even Cherokee, either mingled with them as equals or adopted their manners and civilization. Certain parts of the brain in all classes of animals, says Cuvier, are large or small according to certain qualities of the animals. If then there be reason to believe that different parts of the brain manifest different mental faculties, and if the size of the part influence the power of manifestation, the necessity is very evident of taking into consideration the relative proportions of different parts of the brain in a physiological inquiry into the connection between the crania of nations and their mental faculties. To illustrate this position, we present exact drawings of two casts from nature. One is the brain of an American Indian, and the other brain of a European. Both casts bear evidence of compression or flattening out to some extent by the pressure of the plaster, but the European brain is the flatter of the two. We have a cast of the entire head of this American Indian, and it corresponds closely with the form of the brain here represented. It is obvious that the absolute size of the brain, although probably a few ounces less in the American, might be the same in both. If different portions manifest different mental powers, the characters of the individuals and of the nations to which they belong, assuming them to be types of the races, might be exceedingly different. In the American Indian, the anterior lobe lying between AA and BB is small, and in the European it is large in proportion to the middle lobe lying between BB and CC. At this point in time, I would like to ask that the monitor show this particular brain so that the viewer can understand what is being said here, and I'll repeat that portion. In the American Indian, the anterior lobe lying between AA and BB is small, and in the European it is large in proportion to the middle lobe lying between BB and CC. In the American, the cerebral convolutions of the anterior lobe and upper surface of the brain are smaller than in the European. If the anterior lobe manifests the intellectual faculties, the middle lobe, the propensities common to man with the lower animals, and the posterior lobe, the domestic and social affections, and if size influence the power of manifestation, the result will be that in the Native American, intellect will be feeble, in the European, strong. In the American, animal propensity will be very great, in the European, more moderate. While in the American, the domestic and social affections will be feeble, and in the European, powerful. We do not state these as established results. We use the cuts only to illustrate the fact that the Native American and European brains differ widely in the proportions of their different parts, and the conclusion seems natural that if different functions be attached to different parts, no investigation can deserve attention which does not embrace the size of the different regions insofar as it can be ascertained. Professor Tiedemann admits that there is undoubtedly a very close connection between the absolute size of the brain and the intellectual powers and functions of the brain, asserting also that the Negro races possess brain as large as Europeans. But while he overlooked entirely the comparative size of parts, Morton has refuted him on the equality in the absolute size. The above comparison of two human brains illustrate anatomical divergences between European and American races. This is from The Origin of Race and Civilization, pages 107-108, citing J.C. Knott, M.D., and George R. Glidden, Types of Mankind, 1854. I'd like to draw your attention to this now. One can find marked differences in the size and shape of the teeth, palates, and dental arches of the various races of man. The difference in dentition and dental arch are closely correlated with those in the form and structure of the skull. Professor Wiedenreich shows the graduated distinction between the dental arches of man, Cro-Magnon type, ape man, Pithecanthropus type, and an ape, gorilla. Thus, as we descend to the more primitive type, we find larger sized teeth, a longer palate, and a dental arch that is less curved. The more modern human dental arch has a widely spanned curve with diverging side rows and sharp bends in the place of the canines. Dr. Wilder has shown that the races who have a dental index closest to apes are the Australians, the Andamanese, the Melanesians. Those races furthest from apes in their dental index are Europeans, Polynesians, and prehistoric Egyptians. Thus, a Melanesian with a dental index of 45 is closer to a chimpanzee index of 47.9 than to a European at 41. In a comprehensive study on the face and jaw characteristics, Sir Arthur Keith demonstrated the differences that exist between the palates and teeth of various races of man. The length of the palate of the extinct Rhodesian man measured 63 millimeters, of the Neanderthal skull found at Gibraltar 54 millimeters, of the Australian Aborigine it was 61 millimeters, and of the average Englishman the length was only 50 millimeters. In this respect, the Australian is closer to the primitive Rhodesian man than he is to either the Neanderthal or Englishman. If we compare the size and dimension of the teeth, we would arrive at the same conclusion. Some comparative anatomy of the palates and teeth would clearly indicate that the Englishman and the Australian Aborigine represent two different species. The Origin of Race and Civilization, pages 109 through 111, citing in turn Franz Wiedenreich, Apes, Giants, and Man, 1946, page 2, Harris Wilder, Pedigree of the Human Race, page 228, Sir Arthur Keith, The Antiquity of Man, 1925, volume 2, pages 398 to 401. Well, that's it. Thank you for tuning in. This is iVideo, and I am your host, John Savers. I hope you have found the program interesting, and we do think that there is much of an educational value in it. We do note that some may consider the information controversial. We nevertheless think that it's worth consideration. We have, I think, a situation in which the objective situation has not been made clear to all through a system which is somewhat hostile to the larger, bigger picture, the clearer focus, and have in their efforts to achieve a certain tenditious position focused rather narrowly on just a small aspect of the picture. So in the hopes of broadening the picture and perhaps spurring additional commentary, we have presented this program.